The Suliban would come to deeply regret the day they handed humanity advanced alien technology. Carl Campbell shifted in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight. He wiped sweat from his brow as he stared across the table at Linux, the high-ranking Suliban official. The alien's purple scales glistened under the harsh lights of the conference room. Carl tried to read Linux's expression, but the alien's face was inscrutable. "So let me get this straight," Carl said, leaning forward. "You're willing to give us access to your advanced technology, including this new energy source, in exchange for mining rights on Earth?" Linux nodded, his reptilian eyes unblinking. "That is correct, Mr. Campbell. We believe this arrangement will be mutually beneficial for both our species." Carl narrowed his eyes. Something didn't feel right. The Suliban were known for their technological superiority, but they were also notoriously secretive. Why would they suddenly be so willing to share their advancements with humanity? "And what exactly do you plan to mine on Earth?" Carl asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Linux waved a clawed hand dismissively. "Nothing that would be missed, just some rare minerals that are abundant on your planet but scarce on ours." Carl leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had a feeling that there was more to this deal than Linux was letting on, but he also knew that access to Suliban technology could change the course of human history. It was a gamble, but one that Carl felt he had to take. "All right," he said finally, standing up and extending his hand across the table. "We have a deal." Linux grasped Carl's hand, his claws digging into the human's flesh. "Excellent. I look forward to a long and fruitful partnership between our species." As Carl left the conference room, clutching the data drive with the specifications for the new energy source, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with the devil. But there was no turning back now. Earth desperately needed the alien's technological abilities to survive. But had the naive Suliban alien realized the full ramifications? Only time would tell what giving the highly adaptable and unpredictable humans this kind of technology would lead to. Carl handed the Suliban data drive to Dr. James Nguyen, one of the top scientists at the United Earth Federation. The older Vietnamese man turned the small device over in his hands, marveling at the sleek alien design. He couldn't wait to dive into the secrets it contained. Sitting down at his workstation, James plugged the drive into his computer and began poring over the schematics and equations that filled his screen. His eyes widened as he took in the specifications for the Suliban energy source, Naxium. The math was elegant, the engineering inspired. If he was understanding it correctly, Naxium was a form of zero-point energy, allowing the extraction of limitless power from the quantum vacuum of space itself. James leaned back in his chair, mind reeling at the possibilities. This could solve Earth's energy crisis overnight. No more reliance on dwindling fossil fuels or dangerous nuclear power, clean, abundant energy for all. The aging scientist felt giddy, like a child on Christmas morning. He immediately set to work constructing a prototype Naxium reactor, eager to test the principles and see this world-changing technology in action. But as he delved deeper into the alien specifications, James started to notice odd discrepancies in the data. Certain equations didn't quite add up. There were gaps in the schematics, as if key components were missing. A sinking feeling crept into James's gut. He tried calling Carl to voice his concerns, but the diplomat had apparently been sent off-world on another assignment. Typical. James would have to figure this out on his own. He pressed ahead with his work, but couldn't shake the growing unease. Something felt off about all this. Why would the Suliban leave out crucial information? What weren't they telling humanity? Late one evening, as James tinkered with the prototype reactor in his empty lab, a strange sound caught his attention. A low, pulsing hum seemed to emanate from the machine's core. James approached cautiously, noting an eerie glow that hadn't been there before. The reactor started to rattle ominously. Suddenly, a blinding flash erupted from the device, along with a deafening boom. James felt an invisible force slam into his body, knocking him back. His head cracked against the floor as darkness rushed in to claim him. When James regained consciousness, he found himself lying on a stretcher, face up. UEF security personnel swarmed around him, speaking in terse, clipped tones. Disoriented, James struggled to sit up. A firm hand on his chest pushed him back down. "Easy, Dr. Nguyen. You've had quite the scare." "What happened? The reactor—" James trailed off as he looked past the gathered agents to see the scorched crater where his prototype once sat. The outer casing was nowhere to be seen. Only smoke and charred metal remained. "That's what we'd like to ask you, Doctor," the lead agent said gravely. "It seems your reactor has vanished into thin air." Carl rushed back to Earth, his mind reeling from the news of the reactor's disappearance. He immediately contacted Linux, his voice tight with anger as he demanded an explanation for the missing device and the inconsistencies in the Naxium data. The Suliban diplomat listened calmly, his expression unreadable even over the video feed. "Mr. Campbell, I understand your concerns," Linux said smoothly, "but I assure you there is a perfectly logical explanation. Why don't you come back to Suliban Prime so we can discuss this matter in person?" Carl hesitated, suspicion gnawing at his gut. But he needed answers, and if Linux was willing to provide them, he had to take the chance. He gathered a small team of UEF security personnel and boarded the next ship to the Suliban homeworld. As they approached the capital city, Carl couldn't help but marvel at the alien metropolis rising before them. Towering spires of gleaming metal and glass pierced the sky, connected by a web of sleek transit tubes. Advanced technology was everywhere, from the levitating vehicles zipping through the air to the holographic displays flickering on every street corner. But as they made their way towards Linux's office, Carl noticed something strange in the atmosphere. The Suliban citizens they passed seemed on edge, their movements hurried, and their eyes darting nervously. There was a palpable sense of anticipation hanging in the air, mixed with an undercurrent of unease. When they finally sat down with Linux, the Suliban diplomat wasted no time getting to the point. "The truth is, Mr. Campbell," he said, steepling his clawed fingers, "the Naxium technology was never meant to be fully understood by humans. The missing reactor was a safeguard to prevent your people from reverse engineering it." Linux remained seated, his expression maddeningly calm. "We have been observing your species for decades, Mr. Campbell, and we have come to the conclusion that humanity is not yet ready for the full potential of Naxium. The power it offers, it would be too much, too soon." "That's not your decision to make," Carl snapped. "We had a deal. You promised to share this technology with us, and now you're going back on your word. I demand that you give us the complete specifications and return the missing reactor at once." But Linux simply shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not possible. We will continue to provide Naxium technology to Earth, but on our terms. Your people are simply not ready for more than that." Carl opened his mouth to argue further, but suddenly the door to Linux's office burst open. A squad of Suliban security forces poured into the room, their weapons trained on Carl and his team. The humans quickly drew their own sidearms, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Linux rose slowly from his chair, his demeanor shifting from calm to cold in an instant. "I'm afraid you won't be going anywhere, Mr. Campbell," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You and your team are now prisoners of the Suliban Empire, and you will remain our guests until your United Earth Federation agrees to our terms." The Suliban guards moved in, disarming Carl's team with ruthless efficiency. As they were marched out of the room at gunpoint, Carl caught one last glimpse of Linux's face. The alien's expression was unreadable as ever, but there was a glint of something almost like satisfaction in his eyes. Dread settled in Carl's stomach as the full weight of his situation sank in. He had come to the Suliban homeworld seeking answers, but now he was a prisoner on an alien world, at the mercy of an inscrutable species with unknown motives. And with the fate of Earth's technological future hanging in the balance, the stakes had never been higher. The guards shoved Carl and his team into a small featureless cell deep within the bowels of the Suliban government complex. The door slammed shut with a resounding clang, plunging them into darkness. As Carl slumped against the cold metal wall, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. By trusting the Suliban, he may have doomed not just himself, but all of humanity. Hours crawled by in the darkness, marked only by the occasional footsteps of patrolling guards outside the cell. Carl's mind raced as he tried to make sense of Linux's actions. Why would the Suliban go to such lengths to keep the true nature of Naxium technology hidden? What were they really planning? Just as despair began to set in, the cell door suddenly hissed open. Carl squinted against the harsh light spilling into the room, his heart pounding as he braced himself for whatever new horror the Suliban had in store. But instead of guards, a lone figure stepped into the cell. A human figure. "Dr. Nguyen," Carl gasped, recognizing the scientist despite his haggard appearance. "What are you doing here? How did you find us?" The older man managed a tight smile. "You didn't think you were going on this little adventure without me, did you?" He held up a strange device, alien technology, unlike anything Carl had ever seen. "Tracking your location was child's play with this. But we don't have much time. We need to get out of here and back to Earth. I have a feeling things are about to get a whole lot worse." As if on cue, an alarm began blaring throughout the complex. Dr. Nguyen tossed a spare plasma rifle to Carl. "Looks like our escape might get a little messy. You ready for this?" Carl checked the weapon's charge, then nodded grimly. "Lead the way, Doctor. Let's show these scaly bastards what humans are really made of." Together, the two men slipped out of the cell and into the chaotic corridors of the Suliban stronghold. They had no idea what they were getting into, or what the Suliban's true endgame was. But one thing was certain. The battle for Earth's future had only just begun. Back on Earth, Dr. James Nguyen sat hunched over his workstation, poring over a maze of encrypted files and classified documents. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt from countless sleepless nights spent chasing down leads and piecing together fragments of information. The disappearance of Carl and his team had left a gaping hole in the UEF's leadership, and James was determined to find out why. As he dug deeper, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Suliban operatives had been quietly infiltrating key positions in Earth's governments and corporations, their influence spreading like a cancer through the halls of power. James's blood ran cold as he realized the true scope of their ambitions. The Naxium technology had been a Trojan horse, a way for the Suliban to gain a foothold on Earth and slowly tighten their grip on humanity. Desperate for help, James reached out to his old friend Michael Kowalski, a grizzled former intelligence officer with a talent for sniffing out conspiracies. Together, they began to unravel the Suliban's web of lies and deceit, piecing together a terrifying picture of a future where humanity was little more than a puppet, dancing on alien strings. But their investigation did not go unnoticed. James and Michael soon found themselves in the crosshairs of Suliban assassins, ruthless operatives who would stop at nothing to protect their master's secrets. They were forced to go to ground, constantly moving from one seedy safe house to another, never knowing who they could trust. One rainy night, while holed up in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, their luck finally ran out. The door burst open, and a squad of Suliban killers poured into the room, their weapons spitting deadly plasma bolts. James and Michael fought back with everything they had, but they were hopelessly outgunned. In the chaos of the firefight, Michael took a hit, his chest exploding in a spray of blood and charred flesh. James watched in horror as his friend crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. With a final agonized look, Michael motioned for James to run, to leave him behind and save himself. Tears streaming down his face, James turned and fled into the night, the sounds of plasma fire and alien shouts echoing behind him. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing in a filthy alleyway miles from the warehouse. As he lay there, gasping for breath, the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. He was alone now, the last hope for a world teetering on the brink of subjugation. The Suliban's grip on Earth was tightening with each passing day, their influence worming its way into every facet of society. James knew he had to find a way to expose the truth, to free Carl and his team and stop the Suliban before it was too late. But with his allies dead or captured, and the enemy's power growing by the hour, James realized that the task before him was nearly impossible. He was just one man, a lone voice crying out in a wilderness of lies and deception. But he had to try. For Michael, for Carl, for all of humanity, because if he failed, there would be no one left to stop the Suliban from claiming Earth as their own. Carl paced the cold metal floor of his cell, his mind racing. The Suliban detention facility was a labyrinth of sleek corridors and reinforced doors, every inch monitored by unblinking cameras and stone-faced guards. But he refused to let despair take hold. He had to find a way out, to expose the Suliban's sinister plans. His chance came during a routine interrogation session. As Carl was led into the stark white room, he noticed something different about the young Suliban guard escorting him. A flicker of doubt in his reptilian eyes, a slight hesitation in his movements. The guard's name was Zaxor, and Carl sensed an opportunity. Zaxor stiffened, his scales ruffling. "It is not my place to question the decisions of my superiors." But Carl pressed on, his voice low and urgent. "But surely you must see that this is wrong. Lying to us, manipulating us, holding us against our will. Is this really the kind of society you want to be a part of?" Over the next few interrogation sessions, Carl continued to chip away at Zaxor's resolve. He spoke of the potential for peace and cooperation between their species, of a future where humans and Suliban could work together as equals. And slowly, Zaxor began to listen. One night, as Carl lay in his cell, he heard the soft hiss of the door opening. Zaxor stood in the doorway, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "You're right," he whispered. "What we're doing, it's not right. I want to help you escape." Carl's heart leapt, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What's the plan?" Zaxor quickly outlined his scheme. He would disable the security systems and guide Carl and his team out of the facility, through the twisting streets of the Suliban capital. It was risky, but it was their only chance. As the night cycle fell over the city, Zaxor made his move. The cameras went dark, the locks clicked open, and Carl and his team slipped out of their cells like shadows. They moved silently through the corridors, following Zaxor's lead. But as they emerged into the neon-lit streets, a shout rang out behind them. A squad of Suliban soldiers, led by Linux himself, had discovered their escape. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as Carl and his team ducked for cover. Zaxor froze, torn between his duty and his newfound convictions. But as he watched Linux bark orders to his troops, a cold realization settled in his gut. This was not the path he wanted to follow. With a roar of defiance, Zaxor turned his weapon on his fellow soldiers, blasting a hole in their ranks. Carl and his team surged forward, fighting their way through the chaos and confusion. As they raced through the neon-soaked alleys, plasma bolts whizzing past their heads, Carl felt a surge of adrenaline. Zaxor had given them a chance, a small hope in the face of overwhelming odds. But as the city lights faded behind them and the dark wilderness loomed ahead, Carl knew their struggle was far from over. Linux and his forces would be hot on their heels, determined to drag them back to their cells. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, a desperate race against time and the machinations of a ruthless enemy. But with Zaxor by their side and the truth as their weapon, Carl and his team would stop at nothing to expose the Suliban's plans and save humanity from their grasp. James's hands shook as he peered into one of the pods, his reflection distorted in the curved glass. The face inside was eerily familiar, a twisted mockery of human features spliced with Suliban scales and ridges. The hybrid's eyes snapped open, pure black orbs that seemed to bore into James's soul. He stumbled back, heart pounding in his chest. The implication was clear. The Suliban had been using human DNA to create these abominations, blending their own genetic material to craft the perfect infiltrators. How long had this been going on? How many hybrids had already been released onto an unsuspecting Earth? A sudden explosion rocked the facility, snapping James back to the present. The resistance fighters must have engaged the Suliban forces. He had to find a way back to them, to warn them about this new threat. James sprinted down the dimly lit corridors, the sound of plasma fire and shouting echoing through the metal walls. He rounded a corner and nearly collided with a hulking Suliban soldier, its eyes glinting with malice. The alien raised its weapon, but James was faster. He lunged forward, grappling with the Suliban in a desperate struggle. They crashed against the walls, trading blows in a brutal dance of survival. James managed to wrench the plasma rifle from the Suliban's grasp, turning it on his foe with a snarl. The alien's head snapped back as the bolt struck, scales sizzling and flesh charring. The body crumpled to the floor, twitching in its death throes. Panting, James scooped up the fallen soldier's weapon and pressed on, the weight of his discovery driving him forward. He had to find Jack and the others, had to find a way to stop the Suliban's twisted plan. As he raced through the labyrinthine halls, James's mind reeled with the implications of what he had seen. The Suliban had been planning this for years, decades even. They had been patiently biding their time, slowly eroding humanity's defenses from within. And now, with their hybrid army poised to strike, the Suliban were on the verge of total victory. Earth's fate hung by a thread, and James was the only one who knew the true extent of the danger. He burst into a large hangar and immediately dove for cover as plasma bolts whizzed overhead. Jack and the resistance fighters were pinned down on the far side of the room, desperately trying to hold off a wave of Suliban attackers. James risked a glance over his makeshift barricade, his blood running cold at what he saw. Among the Suliban forces were several of the hybrids, their movements unnaturally fluid and precise. They advanced on the resistance fighters with a single-minded determination, heedless of the plasma bolts peppering their bodies. Jack's eyes widened in shock, but he nodded grimly. "Fall back to the shuttles," he barked to his team. "We'll blow this place to hell on our way out." James laid down covering fire as the resistance fighters made their retreat, plasma bolts sizzling past his head. He could feel the heat of the aliens' weapons, could smell the acrid stench of burning flesh. Just as he was about to make his own dash for the shuttles, a searing pain erupted in his shoulder. James cried out, his weapon clattering to the ground. He looked down to see a blackened, smoking hole in his flesh, the edges of the wound already blistering. Through the haze of pain, he saw a figure striding towards him, a cruel smile playing across its scaled face. Linux leveled his plasma rifle at James's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. James closed his eyes, waiting for the searing kiss of plasma that would end his life. But instead of the killing blow, he heard a sudden, sharp intake of breath. His eyes snapped open to see Linux staggering back, a look of shock and pain etched across his alien features. Behind the Suliban stood Jack, a smoking plasma pistol in his hand. "Not today, you scaly bastard," he growled. James recoiled from the hybrid monstrosity, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to warn the others. He turned to flee, but found himself face to face with the barrel of a plasma rifle. Linux stepped out from the shadows, a cruel smile playing across his scaled face. "Going somewhere, Doctor?" the Suliban hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. James felt rough hands seize him from behind, dragging him before Linux. The Suliban commander circled him like a predator, toying with its prey. "You've stumbled upon our little secret, Dr. Nguyen," Linux said, his voice dripping with malice. "But it's only the beginning. These hybrids are just the first step in our plan to bring the galaxy to its knees." He leaned in close, his fetid breath hot against James's face. "The Naxium technology you so eagerly embraced? It was designed to control, to bend the will of those exposed to it. With the reactors already in place on Earth and our hybrid army ready to deploy, humanity's fate is sealed." James struggled against his captors, but their grip was unyielding. Linux drew a wicked-looking blade from his belt, the edge glinting in the harsh light. "And now, Doctor, your meddling comes to an end. A shame, really. You could have been useful to us in the end." He raised the blade to James's throat, ready to spill the human's lifeblood across the cold metal floor. But before he could strike, a massive explosion shook the facility, sending Linux and his guards stumbling. James seized the moment, wrenching free of his captor's grasp and diving for cover as plasma bolts sizzled through the air. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw a familiar face. Carl, charging into the fray with Zaxor and a ragtag group of Suliban resistance fighters at his side. "James!" Carl shouted, tossing him a spare plasma rifle. "Catch!" James snatched the weapon from the air, rolling to his feet and opening fire on the Suliban forces. He fought his way to Carl's side, the two men falling into a familiar rhythm as they cut a path through the enemy. Around them the battle raged, plasma bolts scorching the walls and the screams of the wounded filling the air. James caught a glimpse of Zaxor, locked in combat with a Suliban soldier. But as he watched, a second figure emerged from the smoke, a mirror image of Zaxor himself. The hybrid clone lunged at Zaxor, its movements unnaturally swift and precise. Zaxor hesitated, unable to bring himself to fire upon his own likeness. That moment of hesitation was all the hybrid needed. It struck like a viper, its blade finding the soft flesh of Zaxor's side. Zaxor cried out in pain, stumbling back as the hybrid pressed its advantage. But before it could land the killing blow, Carl was there, his plasma rifle barking. The hybrid's head snapped back, scales sizzling as the bolt found its mark. Carl hauled Zaxor to his feet, the Suliban's blood seeping through his fingers. "We have to end this," he growled, his eyes hard. "We have to destroy this place, and the Naxium with it." James nodded grimly. "The reactor core, if we can overload it, the chain reaction will take out the whole facility." They fought their way deeper into the complex, the resistance fighters holding the line against the Suliban onslaught. The reactor loomed before them, a pulsing mass of alien technology and raw power. James and Carl raced to the control panel, their fingers flying over the holographic interface as they initiated the overload sequence. The reactor began to hum ominously, a blinding light building within its core. "Well, what have we here?" James spun to see Linux standing at the entrance to the reactor chamber, his face a mask of rage and hatred. The Suliban commander raised his blade, his eyes burning with a fanatic light. "You think you can stop us? You think you can destroy everything we've worked for?" He advanced on James and Carl, his movements predatory. "I'll tear you apart with my bare hands before I let that happen." James and Carl exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They charged forward to meet Linux head-on, plasma bolts and sparks flying, as they clashed in a brutal dance of death. The fate of Earth, of the galaxy itself, hung in the balance as they fought, the reactor's whine rising to a deafening crescendo, and the light within it growing blinding. The final battle had begun. Carl's plasma rifle clattered to the floor as Linux's blade sliced into his arm. He grunted in pain, but managed to duck under the Suliban's next swing, slamming his shoulder into the alien's chest. Linux stumbled back, his eyes wide with surprise and rage. James leapt into the fray, grappling with Linux for the blade. The two men strained against each other, muscles trembling with exertion. Carl, clutching his bleeding arm, scanned the control panel for any way to stop the overload. The reactor's whine was reaching a fever pitch, the light within it searing his retinas. With a roar of effort, James wrenched the blade from Linux's grasp, sending it skittering across the floor. He drove his knee into the Suliban's midsection, doubling him over. Carl, seeing his chance, snatched up the blade and plunged it into Linux's back, piercing his heart. The Suliban commander let out a gurgling cry, his eyes wide with shock. He slumped to the floor, dark blood pooling beneath his body. But even as the life drained from him, Linux's hand shot out, his claws wrapping around a small device on his belt. He pressed a button on the device and a new alarm began to blare, even louder than the reactor's whine. A cold, computerized voice echoed through the chamber. "Failsafe initiated. Facility self-destruct in T-5 minutes." Carl and James exchanged a look of horror. They had to get out now. They sprinted from the reactor chamber, the floor shaking beneath their feet as the facility began to tear itself apart. Explosions rocked the corridors, sending debris raining down around them. They rounded a corner and nearly collided with Zaxor, who was leading a group of battered resistance fighters. The Suliban's face was pale, his hand pressed against a bloody wound in his side. "We have to go," he gasped. "The whole place is coming down." They raced through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling rubble and sparking cables. Suliban loyalists and hybrids emerged from the shadows, their weapons spitting plasma. Zaxor and the resistance fighters fought a desperate rearguard action, buying Carl and James precious seconds. The ground bucked and heaved as they neared the surface, the moonquakes growing more violent with each passing moment. Just as they reached the final airlock, the floor gave way beneath them, sending them tumbling into a hidden hangar. A sleek Suliban spacecraft sat in the center of the hangar, its hull gleaming in the emergency lighting. Carl and James stumbled aboard, Zaxor close behind. The Suliban collapsed into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. "Hold on," he said through gritted teeth. "This is going to be rough." The ship's engines roared to life, and they rocketed out of the hangar just as the entire facility imploded behind them. The shockwaves slammed into the ship, sending it tumbling end over end. Alarms blared in the cockpit as Carl and James clung to their seats, the G-forces threatening to crush them. Somehow Zaxor managed to regain control, straightening out their trajectory and pointing the ship's nose towards Earth. They had escaped the moon, but as they broke orbit, a new crisis emerged. A distress call from Earth filled the cockpit, a desperate plea for help. The Suliban, in a final act of defiance, had activated the Naxium reactors across the planet. Cities were in chaos, the very fabric of society unraveling as the mind control technology took hold. "We have to stop them," James said, his voice raw. "We can't let them win, not after everything we've been through." Carl nodded grimly. "Zaxor, can this ship interface with the Naxium network?" As if on cue, a dozen Suliban warships appeared on the view screen, their weapons already locking onto the small craft. Carl and James exchanged a look of grim determination. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but they had no choice. Earth needed them, and they would not fail. Not now, not when they were so close. Carl took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the unfamiliar controls. "All right, Zaxor," he said, his voice steady. "Let's show these bastards what humans are made of." The Suliban ships opened fire, filling the void with deadly plasma. Carl wrenched the controls, sending their craft into a dizzying spiral. James, hunched over the weapons console, returned fire, the ship's advanced targeting systems helping him find his mark. But even as they fought, weaving through the enemy fleet with desperate skill, they knew they were only buying time. They had to reach the surface, had to shut down the Naxium network before it was too late. Zaxor, his face bathed in the eerie glow of the ship's displays, worked feverishly to hack into the network. His fingers danced across the controls, his brow furrowed in concentration. Every second counted, every moment a precious commodity they could ill afford to waste. The ship shuddered as a plasma bolt grazed its hull, alarms blaring in the cockpit. Carl gritted his teeth, fighting to keep them on course. The enemy ships were closing in, their weapons growing ever more accurate. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, Zaxor let out a triumphant cry. "I'm in!" he shouted over the din of battle. "I've accessed the Naxium network, shutting it down. Now!" On the view screen, the Earth loomed large, its surface obscured by roiling clouds of smoke and ash. For a moment nothing happened. Then, slowly, the clouds began to dissipate, the fires on the planet's surface winking out one by one. They had done it. Against all odds, they had stopped the Suliban's plan and saved Earth from total subjugation. But even as relief washed over them, a new realization dawned. The Suliban fleet, no longer bound by their commander's orders, turned their full attention to the small craft that had thwarted their plans. Plasma bolts filled the void, hammering into the ship's failing shields. Carl, James, and Zaxor exchanged a look of grim understanding. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Earth was safe, for now, but the Suliban would not rest until they had their revenge. As the ship plunged into Earth's atmosphere, trailing smoke and fire, They knew that their fight had only just begun. The future was uncertain, the path ahead fraught with danger and hardship. But they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to defend their world and their people no matter the cost. For they were human, and they would never, ever surrender. The ship hit the ground hard, skidding across the barren landscape in a shower of sparks and debris. Inside the battered craft, Carl, James, and Zaxor lay slumped in their seats, their bodies broken and bleeding, but their eyes were open, and in them burned the unquenchable fire of human determination. They had taken the first steps on a long and perilous journey, a journey that would test them in ways they could scarcely imagine, but they would not falter, would not fail. For the sake of Earth, for the sake of all they held dear, they would fight on to the bitter end if need be. The Suliban had unleashed a storm upon the galaxy, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. Never underestimate the power of human resilience. Never underestimate the strength of the human spirit. For when pushed to the brink, when faced with the unimaginable, humans would always find a way to rise above, to overcome, to triumph. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning, and Carl, James, and Zaxor would be there to meet it, head-on and unafraid. The future was theirs to shape, theirs to define. And they would not rest until the Suliban threat was vanquished, once and for all. In the depths of space, Zaxor's hands flew over the ship's controls, his intimate knowledge of Suliban technology guiding his every move. The small craft darted and weaved through the enemy fleet, plasma bolts sizzling past the hull as Carl and James manned the weapon systems. "Hold on!" Zaxor shouted as he sent the ship into a dizzying spiral, narrowly avoiding a barrage of enemy fire. The Earth loomed before them, a once familiar sight now tainted by the chaos and destruction wrought by the Suliban's machinations. As they entered the atmosphere, the ship shuddered and bucked, the heat of re-entry enveloping the craft in a fiery glow. Suddenly, a new threat emerged from the clouds. Hybrid fighters, their sleek forms cutting through the air with unnatural grace. James felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the ships, piloted by the very clones he had discovered on the moon. The aerial battle that followed was fierce and unrelenting, the sky filling with the flashes of plasma fire and the trails of smoke. Zaxor pushed the ship to its limits, his piloting skills put to the ultimate test as he navigated the chaotic skies. Carl and James worked in tandem, their fingers flying over the weapons controls as they tried to keep the enemy fighters at bay. The ship shuddered as a plasma bolt grazed the hull, alarms blaring in the cockpit. Zaxor gritted his teeth, fighting to keep the ship under control as they plummeted towards the Earth's surface. The ground rushed up to meet them, a sea of green rapidly approaching. With a bone-jarring impact, the ship crashed into a dense forest, trees splintering and earth churning as the craft skidded to a halt. For a moment there was only silence, broken by the hiss of escaping gases and the crackle of small fires. Carl, James, and Zaxor emerged from the wreckage, battered and bleeding but alive. They had reached the Earth, but their mission was far from over. In the distance, the sounds of battle echoed through the trees, a reminder of the war that still raged across the planet. Injured but determined, the trio set off into the undergrowth, their steps heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. They had to reach the central Naxium control hub, hidden deep within a mountain range. The fate of the Earth and all of humanity depended on their success. The journey was arduous, the dense forest and rugged terrain slowing their progress. Every step was a battle, every breath a struggle. But they pushed on, driven by a shared resolve to put an end to the Suliban's insidious plot. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the base of the mountains, the entrance to the control hub looming before them. The facility was heavily guarded, hybrid soldiers patrolling the perimeter with cold, unfeeling efficiency. Zaxor, using his Suliban credentials, managed to infiltrate the facility's security systems, his fingers dancing over the control panel as he worked to disable the alarms and cameras. With a final keystroke, he nodded to Carl and James, signaling that the way was clear. The two humans slipped inside, their weapons at the ready as they crept through the dimly lit corridors. The air was thick with the stench of ozone and the hum of alien machinery, a palpable sense of wrongness pervading every inch of the facility. They fought their way through the hybrid guards, plasma bolts scorching the walls, and the cries of the wounded echoing through the halls. Every step was hard-won. Every enemy felled a small victory in the face of overwhelming odds. Finally, they reached the central control room, the heart of the Naxium network. But as they stepped inside, they were confronted by a sight that stopped them cold. There, standing before them, was Michael, James's old friend, a man they thought had died in the warehouse attack. But he was changed, his body twisted and warped by the Suliban's vile experiments, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Michael," James whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "what have they done to you?" The hybrid that had once been Michael smiled, a cold and cruel thing that held no trace of the man James had known. "They have made me strong," he said, his voice a guttural rasp, "stronger than you could ever imagine." James shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "No, this isn't you. You have to fight it, Michael. You have to remember who you are." But Michael only laughed, a harsh and bitter sound. "I know exactly who I am," he snarled, "and I know my purpose, to serve the Suliban and to crush all who stand in their way." With a roar of primal fury, Michael launched himself at James, his modified body moving with terrifying speed and power. James barely had time to react, bringing his arms up to block the blow that would have taken his head off. As Carl rushed to the control panel, desperate to shut down the Naxium network, James and Michael engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand battle, a clash of two former friends turned bitter enemies. They traded blows with savage intensity, the fate of the Earth hanging in the balance. James fought with every ounce of skill and strength he possessed, but Michael was relentless, his enhanced body shrugging off blows that would have felled a lesser man. The two crashed through the control room, smashing equipment and sending sparks flying. "Michael, please," James begged, even as he dodged a vicious swipe of his friend's clawed hand. "You have to stop this. This isn't you." But Michael only snarled, his eyes blazing with a feral light. "You're wrong," he growled. "This is what I was always meant to be." As the battle raged on, Carl worked feverishly at the control panel, his fingers flying over the alien interface as he tried to shut down the Naxium network. The fate of the world rested on his shoulders, and he would not fail. As James and Michael fought in the control room, their battle taking on a desperate primal intensity, Carl raced to shut down the Naxium network. His fingers flew across the alien interface, sweat beading on his brow as he worked to sever the Suliban's hold on Earth. "Michael, please," James gasped. "You have to remember who you are, remember our friendship, all the times we had each other's backs, sir." For a heartbeat, something flickered in Michael's eyes, a glimmer of recognition. His grip on James loosened, his face contorting as if in pain. But then his features hardened, his eyes blazing with renewed fury. He roared, slamming James to the ground with inhuman strength. "You're my enemy," Michael snarled. "You're trying to trick me." He raised his fist, ready to deliver a crushing blow. James closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. Instead, an eerie silence filled the room. James opened his eyes to see Michael frozen, his face a mask of confusion. Around them, the hum of machinery faded, the lights flickering and dying. Carl had done it. The Naxium network was offline. Michael staggered back, clutching his head. He screamed, a sound of pure agony that tore at James's heart. The hybrid programming that had controlled him was unraveling, his mind caught between two worlds. James struggled to his feet, reaching out to his friend. "Michael, it's over. You're free now. Let me help you." But Michael recoiled, his eyes wild with pain and terror. "No," he cried, "and stay back. I can't. I don't know what's real anymore." He lashed out, his movements erratic and desperate. James tried to defend himself, but he was exhausted, his reflexes dulled by the long fight. Michael's fist caught him in the jaw, sending him reeling. As James lay stunned, Michael loomed over him, his face a twisted mask of rage and confusion. He wrapped his hands around James's throat, squeezing with a strength born of madness. James clawed at Michael's hands, black spots dancing in his vision. He could feel the life being crushed out of him, his lungs burning for air. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. With the last of his strength, he reached for the plasma pistol at his side. His fingers closed around the grip, the weapon heavy in his hand. "I'm sorry, Michael," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry." He pressed the barrel to Michael's chest and pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt tore through flesh and bone, the smell of burning meat filling the air. Michael's eyes went wide, his grip on James's throat slackening. He looked down at the smoking hole in his chest, then back at James, a look of confusion and betrayal on his face. Then he collapsed, his body going limp. James caught him, cradling his friend's broken form as sobs racked his body. Carl rushed over, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. He placed a hand on James's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. Azaxa's voice crackled over their comlink, urgent but tinged with relief. "The Suliban forces are in disarray," he reported. "Their hybrids are collapsing, the Naxium's control broken." But James barely heard him. All he could see was Michael's face, the light fading from his eyes. The friend he had lost, the brother he had been forced to kill. They had won, but at a cost that James knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Slowly, numbly, they made their way out of the facility, stepping into a world forever changed. The sky was dark with smoke, the distant sounds of fighting still echoing across the ravaged landscape. But as they emerged, they saw signs of hope amidst the devastation. Human survivors, battered but unbowed, picking through the rubble. Suliban soldiers, their weapons cast aside, aiding in the rescue efforts. The war was over, but the true struggle was just beginning. The long, painful process of rebuilding, of healing the deep wounds that had been inflicted on both their worlds. As they walked through the ruins, James felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Zaxa, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I cannot return to my people," the Suliban said softly. "I am a traitor in their eyes, a pariah, but perhaps I can find a new purpose here, helping to rebuild what has been lost." Carl nodded, his own face etched with the weight of all they had endured. "We'll need all the help we can get," he said. "The road ahead will be long and hard." James said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew that he would never be the same, that the scars of this conflict would stay with him forever. But he also knew that as long as there were those willing to stand against tyranny, to fight for what was right, there would always be hope. Even in the darkest of times, light could still endure. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.